We're going to go straight to Washington, D.C. now, where Jerry Seib is standing by, where he's coordinating our coverage efforts here at the Wall Street Journal. Jerry, what do you make of this? It's somewhat expected that Mitt Romney would win. Is the margin the key, do you think?
Well, the margin's important, but it looks as if the margin will be about what it needed to be for Mitt Romney to avoid any sort of dashed expectations storyline coming out of New Hampshire, and that's in and of itself hugely important. Look, it's also important, I think, to Mitt Romney that if you look at who's trailing behind him in New Hampshire, it's Ron Paul and Jon Huntsman. Those are not two people who look as if they have the staying power to become the real threats to him. You know, all along the Romney campaign has been much more worried about the potential for the Newt Gingriches or the Rick Perrys or even the Rick Santorums to take off. Those are people who have kind of a broader standing within the party and more of the potential to build a national movement behind them. And they're mired back in the pack, and in Rick Perry's case, didn't even compete in New Hampshire. So, you know, one of the things that's advantageous for the Romney campaign here is that it's not just that he won; it's that the people he beat tonight in New Hampshire aren't the kind of people who are likely to challenge him in other states in a serious way. So he gets the benefit of winning and gets the benefit of having decent competition going forward.
Jerry, what do we see in the voting instincts of the big independent voter bloc in New Hampshire? Do we see any trends emerging there, and anything that could maybe give us a kind of a peek into what might happen in the national election?
Yeah, it's a good question, John, because what you're seeing there, I mean, first of all, it's stunning that almost half the voters in New Hampshire, based on exit polls, are declaring that they're voting in a Republican primary today, but they actually consider themselves to be independent voters. Among those people, Ron Paul and Jon Huntsman did very well, and that's kind of what you'd expect. They're the least conventional of all the Republican candidates. But Mitt Romney does pretty well amongst those people, too. You know, Rick Santorum does really well amongst really conservative, hardline Republicans. But amongst those independents, and that's, as you suggest, John, where the race will be determined not now, but in November, Mitt Romney does reasonably well amongst them. And you get the sense that Ron Paul did what he did in New Hampshire, what he did in Iowa, which is draw in a lot of those unconventional, not really very Republican voters into a Republican voting contest.
What I see when I look at this, Jerry, is that Mitt Romney has a ton of money behind him. When we go down to South Carolina, and you'll be covering moderating the debate there with Fox News, and looking at that Mitt Romney will still be the leader. The other vote will be split considerably. It seems obvious that unless there's some major upset, he wins. Why is anyone staying in the race? What could that upset possibly be?
Well, you know, the one thing we have to all be careful of is not to get too far ahead of ourselves. There's been one primary now, New Hampshire. Iowa is a caucus, which is a different and stranger breed. And at some point, voters tend to say things that we don't expect them to say. And so the reasons to stay in the race are, A, weird things can still happen and it's still very early. B, the campaign is moving into territory now, South Carolina in particular, but also Florida next, that aren't nearly so friendly for Mitt Romney as New Hampshire was. And that in addition and above all of that, you know, there is the reality that there's a lot of money to be spent on advertisements that attack Mitt Romney on Bain Capital. That's the new line of attack, and I think that's the Pandora's box that's been opened in New Hampshire. And you could hear it in Newt Gingrich tonight that that's not going to stop. And we'll see if that has more of an impact on the Romney vote when it has more time to sink in a less favorable state. That means South Carolina.
Yeah, I mean, that really does seem to be an emerging issue here, and the Democrats must be gleeful about this. I mean, you have Rick Santorum talking about Mitt Romney as not reflecting and not representing the middle class. You have a super PAC for Newt Gingrich taking him to task over Bain Capital, and Gingrich saying, you know, here's a rich guy looting companies. I mean, this is like something out of the PR department of the AFL-CIO almost. And it seems that it would kind of cleave the GOP, weaken it going into a national election where the Democrats will just want to rerun these ads.
Well, I think, John, what it does is it gives credibility in advance to the ads that you knew the Democrats were going to run along these lines anyway. I don't think it affects the line of attack Democrats are going to use. They would probably get there fairly quickly anyway. The problem is, as you suggest, they can essentially now quote Republicans back to the national voting public and say they're the guys who said that Mitt Romney was a shredder of jobs, not us. And it gives gives the attacks a little more bite when they come from Democrats and gives them a little more credibility. And that is a big, serious long-term concern.
And we haven't even seen the real sort of onslaught of this, right? This is supposed to now happen in South Carolina, so where where this documentary on Romney gets rolled out and really shown.
Right, because you got to remember, you know, Newt Gingrich has a new infusion of money. Rick Santorum has a new infusion of money. Rick Perry saved the money that he had and he carried it down to South Carolina. So that's where this all gets unleashed. And we just saw the beginning of it in New Hampshire.
Now we saw Mitt Romney say that President Obama sort of has a war on enterprise, and then he switched that around and said, look, and some of my opponents in this GOP race also seem to have a war on enterprise too. Do you think that was an effective rebuttal? Do you think that will manage to dispel some of the myth, not the myth, some of the damage that was done to him by this?
Yeah, I think it probably does. But, you know, look, the narrative of the Romney campaign is that the paramount issue in the country is jobs. My qualification that sets me apart from all others, including President Obama, but also including everybody else in the Republican field, is that I have a lot of experience in the private sector and I know how to create jobs. The Bain Capital attacks undercut that narrative because they suggest that your private sector experience was in cutting jobs, not creating jobs. So that's a problem. You know, the Romney campaign, I must say, though, is very good, and they're very polished at dealing with this sort of thing. It's not as if they didn't think this was coming. They've always worried about these kinds of attacks on the Bain Capital record. But as John suggested, they worried a lot more about them coming from Democrats than coming from Republicans.